Greetings ladies and gents, and welcome to this match video for Mud's mission taken from the website Royal Road. As always, I hope that you all enjoy this episode, and if you do, please consider supporting the channel. Also, all of these episodes will be available as a podcast on the various different podcast platforms. All the links will be down below. Chapter 17, Misappropriation. The raven's wings, as the raven had taken to calling them, or Mald's forest hunting party, as they were actually registered, proceeded further east into the foothills of the looming Pankel Mountains. The leader of the expedition, the bearded swordsman Mald, led the way, followed closely by the boxer Kim and the demi-human Ovis. Behind them trailed the raven, or rather Susie, clutching her spear tightly, eyes constantly scanning the dark depths of the treetops around her. Ever since she found out that they'd been watched by an unknown third party during their fight earlier that day, an act that she herself had not noticed, she had been unable to calm down. When even an experienced and ever-reliable Maud had been unable to identify the creature, her anxiety about the subject rose dramatically, and not that she would ever admit as such to her teammates. The raven had her image to protect. Forcing herself to tear her focus from the trees before she drove herself mad, the raven let her sight rest on the rugged and pleasantly shirtless Kim. At least the trip wasn't all mad, since she got to spend time with the hunky boxer. Even if some weird monster tried to attack them, Kim would just sweep her up in his arms and, Susie's delusions were suddenly interrupted as Mald held up his shield arm and slowed, the signal that he'd spotted enemies. The raven readied her spear and got into a low stance, the posture that allowed her to more easily make sudden movements in combat. Kim similarly lowered his stance and raised his loosely clenched fists into his chin. Moving at her own pace as usual, the sheep-horned priest merely stood straight and held her creepy-looking Yaldabaoth statue to her chest. The raven was glad to the distraction of battle, as it would help her put a mystery of the peeping monster out of her mind. Although monsters around this area wouldn't grant any significant amount of experience for her, the rewards from the association for getting these monsters would be useful. While her entropy magic was strong, it had the unfortunate side effect of damaging her weapons with each use. Constantly buying replacement spears had become a significant financial burden for the fledgling mage. Glancing down at her new spear, she was satisfied that it would last a few more hunts. As the raven's wings stood in formation, time passed slowly, until finally a trio of short green humanoids rounded a tree and into the clearing. Goblins. As the first goblin spotted the party, it was momentarily struck dumb by the surprise at the sight of a well-armed group and stood frozen in place. The raven hated goblins. They looked disgusting, like squashed-down old men. Their skin was a nauseating shade of pea green, and they were always filthy. It was as if every aspect of their existence was carefully designed to be as annoying and unpleasant for the sapient races as possible. They were clever enough to steal from the farms and kill livestock, but too stupid to grow food for themselves. They bred rapidly and would hunt local wildlife to extinction, but their own meat was foul and inedible. They hated sapiens, and on instinct would kill travelers and adventurers whenever possible, making coexistence impossible. Goblins were truly the blight on the world. Countless times, powerful ascendants and even multinational alliances had tried to wipe them out completely. But such efforts had always failed. No matter how thoroughly they hunted them down, some goblins would crawl out of their hiding place and the problem would return. Some mad enchanters had even attempted extreme magical methods to wipe them out of the planet, although the collateral damage from such methods had been arguably worse than the goblins themselves. In the end, all humanity could do about the menace was to kill them on sight wherever possible. And the Raven Wings planned to do exactly that. The Raven began mumbling the idle form of entropy to taint her mana. She turned her spear towards the rear goblins and prepared to fire a decay bolt. As expected, the party leader began the battle by launching himself forward with his movement skill and sliced deeply into the still stunned lead goblin. Strangely, the goblin seemed almost to dive into Muld's blade, as if its own volition. At the same time, the rainbow-robed Obus touched a figurine against Kim's muscular back, covering his fists in a shimmering opalescence. Kim dashed forward towards the rightmost goblin, lowering his body almost to the floor. Upon reaching the goblin, he shot upright, delivering an uppercut squarely to the goblin's chin. The goblin was sent flying into a nearby tree, dazed. As the third goblin hefted a thick branch in preparation to strike Meld, the raven let loose a spell. The black-rimmed white bolt, which was densely packed with the concept of inevitable decay, travelled up the length of a spear and flew through the air towards the monster. Moments before it struck, the goblin suddenly lurched directly towards the bolt. On impact, it spread across the magical beast's body as normal and caused the monster to rapidly wilt. As stricken goblin's body withered and it fell to the ground, Meld finished off the lead goblin with a stab to the heart. After Kim finished off his dazed opponent with a twisting in its head and the raven killed her target with a stab to the heart, the group returned to their formation. Seeing no new enemies arrive, they finally relaxed. Turning towards her mentor, the raven asked the question that had been on her mind. "Did those goblins seem to be acting weird to you? They almost seemed like they jumped into our attacks on purpose. Goblins may be reckless, but I've never heard of them committing suicide." Mel and the Kim both flinched when she mentioned the goblins jumping, but the veteran swordsman then sighed and answered his student's question. "So even you noticed, Susie?" "The raven." Ignoring her, he continued, "Since you've already said that much, I suppose there's no point in pretending we didn't notice." Meld's eyes flicked towards the treetops. "I think, it was the same thing from last time. It used some kind of spell to make the monsters lose balance right before we struck. It moved farther away afterwards, but I think it's still nearby, probably following us." Susie gripped the spear so tight her knuckles turned white and gasped. That thing's following us, but why? What's it plotting?" Meld wiped his sword clean and put it away on his side, then looked around the trees in a scowl. "I think it's using us to farm experience without risk." Ovis tilted her head and scratched the bottom of her horns. "I don't get it. What do you mean?" The swordsman crossed his arms and sighed. Before he could complain, Kim spoke up. "You know how nobles will hire mercenaries to kill strong monsters for the kids while they sit back and do the bare minimum for contribution. We're being used that way, but without getting paid." "Wow, that's dirty," replied Ovis brightly, clearly not at all upset about being used in such a way. "Well, it doesn't really hurt us, I suppose. It's not like any of us are here for the experience anyway." Still, Mel took one more slow scan of the treetops before crunching down the harvest what he could from the goblin corpses. "I can't say I like being taken advantage of." "Agreed," added Kim with a deep nod. In the center of the clearing, Susie held tight on her spear, her eyes darting to every dark place in the thick canopy above. End of chapter. Chapter 18. Maximized. Are you happy? Do you ever wonder why even the good must suffer pain and torment? Rejoice, for the path to happiness is open to you. The creator of this world, Lynae Hill, feeds from the suffering of mortal souls. This universe was designed purposefully to generate as much pain as possible over a long period of time. Even should you die, you cannot escape the cycle of suffering. In time, your soul finds a new vessel and suffers through hardships anew. But do not despair, for the Lynae Hill has left a path of salvation open to us. The demiurge servants, Abraxas, littered this world with 365 of his children, so that they might suffer in our stead. The monsters, by getting the unaffecting suffering on magical beasts, the suffering of the demiurge desires need not come from the sapiens. But the monsters are clever and have the same plan. They will inflict suffering and death upon us whenever possible. To overcome these hordes and sapient races must unite to work together, feeding each other with our strengths, just as we all feed the great Lynae Hill. If the task seems hopeless, worry not. Our labors need not be eternal. There shall come a time, perhaps sooner than you think, when Lynae Hill was full and fat on suffering of mortals. When that time comes, there'll be no need for this false world. The firmament shall be shattered, and our souls will be returned to the divine. Informational pamphlet distributed by the Church of the Venerable Agnostics. The peeping monster silently listened to the conversing group of humans from its hiding place behind a tree. The humans had, as expected, noticed a much more flagrant interference in this fight. To the golem's surprise, it seems that they had also noticed Mud's interference last time. Although they were clearly wary, the humans did not seem hostile at this time, so Mud judged it safe to continue following them. Experience harvested from striking 2 goblins at the back with force bolt was much larger than the golem expected, 15 for the first one and 13 for the second. Unfortunately, Mud did not get an opportunity to strike the goblin killed by the shirtless human, and so received nothing. Overall, the gains were similar to what it would gain from killing a single slime, and while this method of hunting was extremely safe for Mud, the same could be said for ambushing slimes. Following these humans had several distinct advantages, however. First, Mud wanted to learn more about these mysterious sapiens and their wide variety of fighting styles. So far, every member of the species the golem had encountered acted more or less the same. All grave wolves used the same tactics, as did all slimes and all rats. There were some slight variations, but they were trivial. Humans, on the other hand, varied wildly in method and competence. This made them extremely unpredictable, and thus more dangerous. Learning more about these beings was of high importance if Mud were to protect the master's estate in a long term, as it seemed to generate a lot of human attention. Learning about the group specifically, which operated near Golem's home, was especially important. Other advantages of lesser importance, but still significant to Mud, was scouting the surrounding area safely and meditating on the ideal of control by manipulating these humans to aid it against their will. After the humans finished collecting a few body parts from the goblins, they continued through the woods towards the mountain foothills. Mud was impressed by the vigilance of the black-robed female human. She was constantly looking around the surrounding area, and was checking above herself more often than any human the golem had ever seen. Truly impressive diligence at avoiding a blind spot. Of course, Mud was sure to hide whenever her field of vision passed towards it. Stealth skill has increased to level 4. A short time later, the lead human raised his shield arm. The group, which had been walking casually, suddenly sank into deep stances with the feet apart. Aside from the demi-human, that is, who merely stopped walking. Circling around the group, Mud spotted the likely reason for the halt, a lone goblin sleeping against a tree. The thing was motionless and nearly silent. It was a mystery as to how the bearded human had known it was the monster was there. Mud decided to try an experiment with the newest spell, Force Bolt. So far, the golem had only practiced the spell a few times against inanimate objects. At minimum strength, the spell merely pushed the target. When more mana was fed into the spell, however, the effect amplified. At 5 mana, the power was similar to what a construct would inflict by striking with a limb. This time, against the goblin, Mud wanted to test the upper limits of the spell's potency. Taking aim at the sleeping goblin, Mud began collecting its mana. Mud had already tainted its entire mana pool with the ideal of control, so it only had to impart a specific goal. Controlling momentum, controlling inertia, controlling movement energy. As Mud fed more and more mana into the spell, the force bolt, which had previously been invisible, began to shimmer a pale yellow. As even more mind mana was forced into the spell, the opacity of it increased further. At nearly 50 mana, the spell began making an audible humming noise, and Mud decided to cut the experiment short. Mud released the spell and watched in interest as it flew rapidly towards the sleeping target. Meld held his arm up. In his intuition, unique skill told him that there was a single, low-threat target around the corner. At his signal, the old soldier was pleased to see that his students immediately fell into formation. Susie, despite her troublesome personality, was diligent about practicing her spear form. Kim had a good sense of discipline and always fulfilled his role as an auxiliary vanguard impeccably. Ovis couldn't take a normal fighting stance due to the restrictions of her role, but so long as he and Kim guarded her, that wasn't a problem. Overall, Merle was very pleased with the season's trainees. One ward that he wasn't pleased about was leading through the forest was their mysterious stalker. While the creature didn't seem hostile and was even actively helpful, the fact of the matter was that it was taking advantage of them. It was also impossible to trust an entity that hid itself and which had unknown motivations. Worst of all, the always trustworthy intuition skill was telling him that while this creature wasn't an enemy, it was absolutely not a friend. At the moment, Meld sensed the monster in question circle around the party and heading towards the beast it had sensed. Perhaps it wanted to get in line of sight for a hit so that it could claim experience again. Annoyed at the flagrant manipulation, Meld signaled the group to advance. After only a few steps, however, he lifted his shield arm again and brought the group to a halt. His intuition was blaring. It had started with a tiny spark, even smaller than a low-rank threat. But that spark was quickly increasing to a roaring inferno. Something horrific was forming behind those trees. Full retreat! Run! Mal turned on his heels and began running, pulling a slightly confused Susie along with him. "What is it? What's going on?" asked the perplexed mage as he dragged her through the trees away from the horror their stalker was unleashing. "Don't ask questions, just run!" A few seconds later, the sound of an explosion struck their ears, followed by a shockwave which pushed him to the ground. Branches and chunks of wood as large as his head flew past him. Mald heard nothing over the ringing of his ears. Looking back, he saw several toppled trees in the direction he had fled. At least intuition had finally quieted down. Looking at his party, they had only suffered minor injuries from the blast. Kim had some cuts and bruises, and Susie had a chunk of wood through her leg. Moving calmly with a soft smile, Ovis touched the figurine of her guard against Susie and then Kim, causing their wounds to rapidly close. As she touched Mald, his ability to hear finally returned. Looking around at his disheveled teammates, the swordsman spoke up. "We're returning to town now." End of chapter. Chapter 19. Mashed. "I might have used a bit too much mana," thought Mud in the aftermath. When the shimmering yellow dart of mind mana had impacted the sleeping golem, several things happened in rapid succession. The pale yellow light of the force bolt spread across the side of the goblins facing Mud, then began exerting its influence. Across the affected region of the goblin, all 48 points of mind mana instantly converted into kinetic energy. As the surface of the goblin suddenly accelerated to an incredible speed and subsequently impacted the flesh beneath it, the body of the unfortunate monster was instantly vaporized. Indeed, the force of the pressure was so great that it did not stop after merely obliterating the goblin. The force instead continued into the tree and the ground behind it. As it was pelted with a highly accelerated monster remnant, the thick conifer burst into a kindling, and a crater twice as wide as the goblin itself was formed in the ground. Even the caster itself did not escape unscathed. When the spell struck home, a powerful shockwave was released, accompanied by a flying debris. Mud fell from his perch of the treetops and was impaled entirely by multiple shards of wood. As Mud did not have the internal organs, this did not cause any actual damage. The blast back did serve as a warning to the golem, however. Arcane might be as dangerous to the wielder as to the victim if wielded irresponsibly. What might have happened if Mud had foolishly fed the entire mana pool of 140 as it had originally planned? It was entirely conceivable that the shockwave alone would have been enough to tear Mud into tiny pieces, getting it instantly. In the future, experiments with new magic would be taken with much more care. After expelling the foreign matter and embedding its body, Mud climbed back to the treetops and circled around to check on the condition of the humans. No experience notifications aside from the goblin had appeared, so, much to the golem's disappointment, it had not unintentionally killed them. As the haggard group of humans came into view sprawled on the forest floor, the bearded human abruptly stood up and looked directly at Mud. "Monster! I do not know your intentions, but we are leaving now. Do not follow us." The bearded man stood up unmoving as he waited for a reply. Given the circumstances, it was possible these humans would perceive the experiment with the force bolt as a hostile action. Wishing to avoid any misguided hostilities against the humans, Mud formed a mind magic to Procosia and sent the message to the bearded human. As the spell struck home, the human squinted, but did not react aggressively. Human, known as Mel, that explosion was not a hostile action against your group. Do not seek revenge. The human remained still and the message was sent. As it completed, he spoke calmly. Monster, I am willing to believe that was a mistake, or you would have simply struck us with the spell directly. Regardless, the face of the matter is that we're hurt by your carelessness. If you wish to coexist with humans, you need to learn tact. Finally, showing emotion on his face, Miles scowled. And what were you thinking interfering with our fights without even asking for permission? If you'd merely introduced yourself and asked to tag along, I probably would have agreed. But just butting in uninvited shows a lack of respect, like you see us merely as convenient tools. Mud kept the fact that it did in fact see them only as useful tools to itself. Having lost his cool, Mal began swinging his arms and ranting, You have no idea what kind of tactics we use or how we fight. You could have gotten us killed with your unsolicited help. You can't just run into an unknown group and start randomly slinging spells and assume that it'll work. Lowering his arms, Mal's energy seemed to evaporate. Look, if you want our forgiveness, don't follow us if we leave, all right? I accept that trade. At that, the bearded human turned back towards the group. It agreed to let us leave. Let's head back to town. As the party began leaving, Mel turned his head back and asked one last question. Do you have a name? Yes, came the reply. Due to the unexpected events that a large amount of data generally gained from its excursion, Mud decided to end its hunting and return to the mansion. As the sun sunk down below the horizon, Mud re-entered Sithlar Estate and proceeded to the second floor where Jibrax was working. Oh, you're back sooner than expected, commented the demon flatly as she squinted at a vial of reddish-purple liquid that she was mixing. Did something good happen? Perhaps. It depends on interpretation, came the robotic voice of the young boy in reply. I used 48 points of mana on a false bolt and caused an explosion. You did what? Jibrax momentarily stared wide-eyed at the golem before turning her head back to her alchemy. Yeah, that much mana packed into a bolt would cause some damage. It looks like you didn't kill yourself in the explosion. Too bad about that. The demon laughed darkly. How much mana is usually used in an attack spell? Jibrax elongated a fingernail into a sharp black claw and scraped a purple powder off a moth-like wing into the bubbling mixture. Sort of depends on what they're going for and the spell. For a bolt type, 5 is enough to do a bit of damage to a tier 1. 10 should be enough force to kill a tier 0 instantly, if aimed properly. 50. That's just a waste of mana. Anything that needs that much to hurt could or just avoid a bolt anyway. Maybe if you were trying to knock down a building or something. Continuing to stir the mixture, Jibrax increased the temperature of the heating artifact as she found Sithlar's lab, bringing the liquid to a rolling boil. I see. I also startled a group of humans with the spell. Finally, turning her attention from the potion, Jibrax stood up and looked towards Mud with one hand on her chin. Humans saw you use the spell like that. Did you capture them? It could be bad if word gets back to the town above an unknown monster casting spells like that. It was not viable at the time to restrain them all without killing them. They did not perceive me as hostile, from what I could tell. There is no advantage for them to cause me problems. Rubbing her head, the demon looked like a teenage girl leaned against a nearby table. Oh, you poor naive little golem. You don't understand humans at all. They don't need a reason to act cruel and petty. The mere fact that you exist and aren't under their control is enough for some of them to hunt you down and kill you. That would be a problem. What do you suggest? Jibrax hummed in thought and looked at the roof. After a moment she answered, As I see it, we have 2 choices. Get humans to support you so that they'll hinder the ones that you want to kill you. Maybe even convince the fools that they can control you. And the second option? The demon's face split into a wide grin. We just get so strong that it doesn't matter what those insects do. End of chapter. Chapter 20. Maintenance. The mayor, Guy Fellow, the city council of Gotheus, and other interested parties. The city of Gotheus shall have the honor of hosting His Majesty the First Prince Cain for the Dungeon Festival to take place in the city of Gotheus in this, the 2971st year of the Empire's calendar. His Majesty the King understands that this festival in the past did not have the scope or refinement appropriate for the dignity of the royal family, and as such shall provide financial assistance and resources for the expansion of said event. The following facilities must be completed and made available before the date of the festival. Temporary housing suitable for the Crown Prince and his retinue, specially designed fortifications and constructed near the dungeon's primary entrance, blueprints enclosed. One combat arena of at least 4,000 square units with seating for at least 40,000 spectators. Make sure to clean the streets and move any paupers away from the areas His Majesty the First Prince might visit during his stay. Enclosed are the relevant documents for expansion of the festival and details regarding the proper reception of His Majesty. If you have any questions or require assistance, do not hesitate to contact the office of the Royal Secretarius Bubalus. Official document delivered to the office of Mayor Guy Fellow of Gotheus. That night, Mudd decided to remain home and reflect on the recent events and, more importantly, deal with some unresolved issues that had been bothering him for some time. Piles of rotting refuse littered the back of the yard of Sithela's estate. While Mudd was never specifically ordered to prioritize cleaning, the master having died before giving the order, the golem still felt a certain instinctual need to keep things tidy and organized, perhaps an echo of subconsciously engraved intent into the manner used to carve his body by the master, or merely a quirk of the golem's personality. Regardless, the massive pile of vermin-infested garbage behind the home was extremely irritating to Mudd. But before he could get back to work cleaning the yard, there was one other matter the golem had been ignoring which needed correction sooner rather than later: the corpse of Master himself. Until now, Mudd had merely left him where he fell in the dissection room. While the corpse had mysteriously not rotted, despite being unattended for many days, whatever forces was at play would likely not last forever. Another concern was the body being discovered by a third party. The Master's body would need to be hidden. A certain item located in the very same dissection room came to Mudd's mind when the word assist the situation. Alchemically formulated preservation salts used by the Master to preserve valuable monster parts. Mudd climbed the shelf and grabbed a large jar of the salts and proceeded over to the Master's corpse. Simple instructions on the usage of preservation was helpfully written on the label, and so Mudd had no trouble applying the copious amounts of granular white substance to the Master's body. After Mudd was satisfied that the body was preserved, the golem dragged him down to the basement and instructed Jibrax to hide the corpse someplace in the room that it was unlikely to be discovered. With the problem resolved, Mudd made his way to the backyard and spent the entire night cleaning the garbage and the mansion itself. Housework skill increased to level 9. Housework skill increased to level max. Mayor Fellow wheezed as he climbed up the steep forest trail to the home of Sithla. Entering the clearing in which sat his destination, the sweat-soaked man was momentarily taken aback by the transformation that the place had taken. The yard was trimmed to an even height and cleared the weeds. The walls and the windows of the mansion, which had been covered in a decade of grime and moss, were spotless. The roof was free of leaves and branches that usually covered it entirely. If Guy didn't know better, he would think that the building had just been constructed. So immaculate was its appearance. The refocusing of his destination, the middle-aged man dabbed the light cloth on his forehead and headed for the door. As he reached up to knock, the door opened unexpectedly, revealing the form of Jibrax, Sithla's niece. Hand hovering in place for a moment, Guy cleared his throat and readjusted his tie. "Oh, yes, hello there. Good morning, Miss Jibrax." From partly hidden behind the half-opened door, the pale young woman smiled sweetly in reply. "Hello, Mr. Fellow. I take it you're here for that thing from Uncle Sithla. Just a moment." At that, she closed the door in the mad space. How rude, thought Fellow. Moments later, the door reopened, and the dainty arm handed him a small piece of cloth tied closed with a thin cord. After taking a small bag and handing her money pouch in return, Fellow checked the contents. Inside, Guy found that to be filled with a purplish red powder. "This should help you sleep. Just eat a pinch before bed. Don't take too much at once. You might never wake up." At that disconcerting comment, the teenage girl gave a toothy smile. Mayerfellow began to re-evaluate this younger woman. Before, he had simply treated her as a normal kid, but perhaps that was a mistake. This was a relative of the famous great enchanter, and her appearance implied she knew magic. She likely was not ordinary. Guy made a mental note to keep his eye on the high-potential youth. "If that's all," as the girl began to close the door, Guy held up a hand to stop her. "Just a moment, there are some other matters I need to discuss with you. Last night there was a report of an unknown named monster with strong magic in the nearby woods to the east of here. It wasn't hostile, but you should be careful and not leave the house alone for a time being, at least not until the association completes an investigation." "Understood. Thank you for your concern." She moved to close the door. Guy once again held up his hand. Wait. There's more. I wanted to remind Sithlar that his presence is required at the opening ceremony of the festival in 5 days. "All right, I'll pass the message on to him. Anything else?" "Just one more thing. The mansion looks wonderful. It's like it's transformed completely overnight. What happened?" After sticking her head out of the door and taking a quick look around, Jabrax replied, "Oh, about that?" The teenage girl made a wide smile. "It's none of your business." She slammed the door in his face. What a headstrong youth, thought Mayerfellow. Not that that's a bad thing. Smiling to himself about the interesting new addition to his town, Mayerfellow headed back towards his town. He still had a lot of work to do in the next few days, and things wouldn't get any easier once the festival started. Still, he could see a goal in sight, and it would be nice to get a good night's sleep for once, he thought as he tapped his coat pocket. End of chapter. And that, my friends, concludes this video. I hope that you enjoyed. If you did, please consider supporting the author from the link down below. Otherwise, if you wish to support this channel, there are numerous ways to do so, like liking, subscribing, and possibly even becoming a patron. Otherwise, the easiest way would be to share. And until the next video, I hope that you all have a good one, and I'll see you then. Cheers.